Webinar series about fire mitigation and defensible space. This particular topic today is about deciding where to implement fire mitigation strategies and exploring the deep uncertainty in this space. So this webinar series convenes academic agency and industry experts to discuss where we need to target fire mitigation interventions. And I might have said or not, I'm Alex Hall. I am the faculty director of the UCLA Sustainable LA Grand Challenge. I'm also the director of the UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. And the webinar today is really focused on how we need to target fire mitigation interventions. So the state of California uses hazard maps to determine where defensible space regulations apply. The insurance industry and other private sector actors use an array of risk mapping approaches to inform their decisions. And meanwhile, in the academic community, there's been a significant increase in research in the past few years to understand the wildfire hazard and associated risk. So we have all these different methodologies, and we're here today to explore the implications of them and what they mean for planning our fire mitigation strategies. So joining us today, I'll ask our panelists to say a few words about their perspective on this issue. So today we have Kelly Hareed, who's the head of catastrophe R&D for Liberty Mutual Insurance. We have Ertugrul Tasiroglu, who we know as ET here at UCLA. He's a professor of civil and environmental engineering at the UCLA Samueli School of Engineering. We have Dave Sapsis, who's the research manager for CAL FIRE's Fire and Resource Assessment Program. And we have Shay Broussard, who's the CEO of Flame Mapper. So really a stellar group of people here today to talk us through these issues. And let's see, I guess we will start here with Kelly Hareed, who will say a few words about her perspective on this issue. Kelly, please go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Let's see here. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to talk through a little bit about how in the insurance industry we're thinking about wildfire defense, because I think it's one of the more challenging perils to capture defenses, and it's not sort of a one and done like is the case for many of the other hazards where we operate. So I'll talk through what that means here right now. Share. Okay. So I'm going to show my elder millennialness here in that I brought you guys some delightful clip art today. So I want to talk about how wildfire defense is a little unusual because it behaves a little bit like Swiss cheese. What I mean by that is that we don't have single defenses that are you do a defense and that pretty much has you set for hazards, as opposed to things like flood defense, where if you elevate a house, you're generally going to be protected for floods that are below that depth. Wildfire, every layer of defense that we have has holes in it, that it has things that will not be a perfect level of defense. So to be able to think about how to reduce that risk, we need to layer on multiple layers of defense so that the weaknesses in one layer can be fortified by the strengths in another area. So I'm breaking this down into three big groups in this very quick discussion: building level mitigation, which has garnered much of the attention in California; community level mitigation, so how entire neighborhoods are built; and then landscape scale mitigation, which is focused on the ecology of fire. Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit of an example here of there are a variety of papers that have been trying to break down what are the things that you can do at the building scale to help buildings survive. This is one example that I thought was particularly helpful. It looked at something like 90,000 properties and calculated the likelihood of survival in 5 recent major wildfires. First thing to note about this is that even the best available defenses that were tested in this study, which is a combination of doing building level mitigation, protecting zone 0, which means nothing flammable within 5 feet, and then protecting zone 1, which it goes out to 30 feet and reduces flammable materials. Even the best available defenses that we have give you a coin tosses chance of getting through wildfires in this study. So again, nothing is perfect, but that's okay. We're going to talk about the other pieces of cheese in a minute. It's worth noting that protecting sort of flammable protecting against flammable materials out to 30 feet is pretty uncommon in densely populated parts of California. It exists in some places, but the California building stock is dense enough that this is not particularly material for understanding the built environment as exists. But we have two interventions that are suggested here. One is doing building level mitigation, which can help buy you an extra few percentage in likelihood of surviving, which is fantastic. The downside is that mitigating a building involves updating siding, updating windows, putting screens over your attic vents, protecting your gutters. It can be kind of expensive. And so what's sort of the relative benefit of investing in the building for a few percent change in survival? On the other hand, zone zero, which again is that clearing space around a building out to 5 feet, appears to help a lot. Like out of the tools that we have for building level mitigation, again, there's a little bit of back and forth on this in the literature, but this does seem to be a pretty effective tool that we have available in our toolbox today. So second piece of cheese is community level risk. And this being California, it's worth noting that we are not just in a wildfire crisis, we also are in a housing crisis, that there are strict development limitations that change our patterns of land use and land development. So this is a really great preprint that looks at restrictions on land use. This is a case study in San Diego, where the areas in green cannot have further development or are limited in the further development that they can do on the left. And then the areas on the right in red are areas of high wildfire risk. So to sum up, the only places in the San Diego metropolitan area where we're basically open for development are ones that will double down on our wildfire risk. So our housing crisis and our fire crisis are heading straight for one another. Even if our building patterns do not themselves exacerbate exposure to risk, the buildings that are already there may accumulate more risk because those hazard areas are expanding in the face of climate change. So every one of these little hexagons that you see on this map is a neighborhood that is dense enough that it cannot prevent urban conflagration. And as it falls into the pink high hazard zones, that suggests that those are areas that will see increasing risk of an urban conflagration style fire going forward into the future. So then if you are in a densely built neighborhood, which means that your building level mitigations aren't going to be as effective, what are the other tools that we have in our toolbox? And I just want to highlight a report that we did with Swiss Re last year, looking at sort of ecosystem scale things that we could be doing to reduce wildfire risk. Looking at invasive species management, mechanical thinning, and prescribed fire. Depending on which ecosystem you're in, you have a lot of potential tools in the toolbox, and this is an area of really active research, and would love to talk about this more today. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for giving us a little bit of the insurance industry perspective. Next, we'll hear from Dave Sapsis, who will give us the perspective from CAL FIRE in the state.
And Sophie's got my slides all mounted up. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to step back a little bit and just talk about some terminology so we're all talking on the same page about what we mean by risk, and to kind of contextualize my sort of career-long experience working in wildfire risk and why it has some very, very singular kinds of challenges. Let's go ahead, next slide, Sophie. So again, some real simple definitions, and these have been adopted largely, even though they aren't always used really precisely, because the term risk has some general kinds of usage just regard to likelihood of things happening. But in quantitative risk analysis, the distinguishment between hazard and risk is very straightforward. Hazard is the physical condition that may lead to adverse impacts or damages. It is the agent that causes change. Risk is an estimate of effects or damage arising from hazard. It is an estimate of what those impacts and changes are. And really, risk is what we're concerned with. We want to know not, fires can basically happen, but if they're not doing damage or if they're not doing, much of anything, they're not really much of a risk issue. So it's important, I think, to understand that hazard feeds into risk, but risk is really what we're concerned with. Next slide. There's been a number of attempts to kind of create general rubrics or heuristics to get around understanding specifically wildfire risk. And I've got this 2x2 here where hazard and vulnerability combined produce risk. And hazard has two main components. It's likelihood and sort of the power of that fire's event. And there are different likelihoods of different kinds of powerful fires, largely influenced by fire weather and fuel moisture. The vulnerability side is where fire effects happen. The exposure portion of vulnerability reflects what things are out there that are impacted by fire and how are they valued by society. And some of the things that fire impacts are pretty sort of within the market. You can assign dollar values to them, but many of the things that are out there, particularly ecosystem services like, let's say, wildlife habitat or the integrity of soil profiles, are not market goods, and they're really difficult to put dollar values on. The final piece is the susceptibility of those assets and resources to fire's damage. And it's important to note that that susceptibility is going to be a function of what kind of fire is occurring. In general, low intensity fires have lower capacity to impact the things that we care about. Next slide. So again, we want to know what fire is going to do. And obviously, Kelly talked very specifically about trying to estimate fire impacts to structures because that's a main domain of insurance concerns. But working for the state's forestry department, we're concerned with fire effects on all different kinds of things. And I like I said, I've been at this for a number of years, and this is a wicked problem. And here's just a few of the things that are contributing to making risk estimation difficult. There are random and key pieces of the equation that drive fire hazard: ignitions, weather, resources available to put the fires out. These manifest themselves in terms of uncertainty and probabilities. And probabilities, in particular for rare events, are very, very hard to get good estimates of. The whole system is very dynamic. It is changing at daily, seasonal, and yearly kinds of timeframes. That whole world is kind of moving under our feet. Ultimately, any estimation of future risk involves a forecast, and that's predicting the future. And everybody here is probably pretty familiar with a lousy weather forecast. Weather forecasting is very, very important in wildfire risk, and it's just one part of that uncertainty. We do these kinds of estimations using models, and models are simplifications of the world. And when you simplify the world, you leave things out. That's just a fundamental reality of having to do forecasts. These models come in a whole lot of different formats and scopes and reducibilities. And a lot of people are building these models. And as a model builder, we've done less than a stellar job of really conveying the boundaries and the scope and the real focus of what these models are trying to address. Lastly, I will say that it's very important when you're talking about risk to, at the very front of that, determine what you are thinking about those impacts towards. Again, wildfires create a plethora of different kinds of impacts to ecosystems and to social and public health, and different risk models will be targeted to different kinds of different assets and resources. So again, in sum, all of that trying to predict where impacts are going to occur such that you're going to design mitigations to reduce that. And again, you can mitigate and reduce hazard, and you can mitigate exposures, and you can mitigate vulnerabilities. All of that is in the toolbox, but you need a targeted sort of framework and partly just a foundational set of terms to understand how you go about defining risk and then portraying that to the public and then deciding on what kind of a mitigation strategy is the most prudent given the circumstances. So I think that's the last of my slides, maybe, Sophie. I included here just one graphic that we've got. I always want to include a graphic. Here is just our internal estimation of the frequency of severe fire weather. Fire weather is really important in driving adverse impacts. Urban conflagrations only generally occur under really extreme dry wind events. And this is the frequency of severe fire hours expected in a given year. And you can see the distribution of sort of fire weather really geographically being much more abundant in Southern California. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Dave. Next up, we have Shay Broussard, who's going to talk to us from the perspective of the private sector. Go ahead, Shay.
Hey, everybody. Nice to meet you all. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm going to share my screen here, and we'll go ahead and get started. Do that. Let's see. Come on. Okay, do you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Hey, everybody. I'll give you a quick background about myself. Again, Shay Broussard, FlameMapper CEO. Basically, FlameMapper is a technology company that specializes in providing near real-time wildfire behavior modeling, science-informed mitigation planning, and curated wildfire data. As you see, we hold multiple patents in AI and machine learning. We're the community. I'm part of the Community Wildfire Brigade program, one of the founding members of that. And what got me into this is my whole journey began when I was 8 years old, as I dug the charred, burned remains of what was left of my family's home. As you can imagine, that was deeply impacted by that, but not just losing my house, but how the community was just ripped apart. That being said, that really drove my interest. And in retrospect, it's probably one of the best things that ever happened to me. It's hard to say that, but it really, at that age, I think it was effective. It really kind of drove my entire career path and got me to where I am today, and has given me the passion and motivation to kind of solve some of these problems. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit about briefly who I am, and I want to just kind of touch on kind of what we do as a company. So we have 4 main business sectors and categories that we currently support. As you get into space, there's a lot of things you can support. So the hardest part is focusing just on the 4 you think that are the most impactful. So these are the 4 categories that we kind of have dove into, which is our mitigation design, which we do a lot for like City of Beverly Hills, City of Woodside Fire Protection Districts, Portola Valley. And then we have our other product lines of Ambercast, which is a real-time predictive analytics, which I'll show you a little bit here. And that's kind of real-time behavior analytics. And then we have our Beacon Box solution, which is kind of really blowing up at the moment, and people are really excited about it. We had 10 of them being used during the LA fires. And which provide tremendous value to those out-of-area firefighters coming in. And then we have our risk data products, which we work with some of the larger reinsurers to basically help better understand what is the overall risk in certain areas and how they can better understand that. So with that being said, my personal opinion and my personal vision is like, my vision is a world where people feel equipped to mitigate the potential impacts of wildfire. Now, from my perspective, the impacts of wildfire are mitigatable. We have had 100 years of improper fire regime management, which I think we can all agree on, which kind of got us to where we are today. Now, that being said, this isn't hail, this isn't hurricane. That's similar to what Kelly kind of front on. This is a different kind of thing. But however, I do think that a little mitigation could go a long way. The prevention versus cure philosophy is really powerful. We've done it for some of our clients. It does work. Mitigation is effective. It's not sexy. So we're kind of have to cross that battle and deal with that. So that's one of the hardest challenges that we have to kind of work with. So with that being said, we'll jump into, I want to kind of show this example. I was deployed as engine captain during the Palisades fire, and I've heard a mountain wave. I've never seen one. This is a mountain wave. And basically what it is a perpendicular wind pattern to a Santa Ana wind. And what it does is it spins these air columns. And this is basically a spinning air column of embers, which just lights everything on fire that's in its path. And so we're just outside the spinning vortex of doom here. But it gets processed. These are the conditions that we're seeing out there that are kind of hard to put into words unless you are there and actually see them. So here I am standing in the middle of the firestorm. I'm firefighter 1 certified, firefighter 2 certified and trained. I'm federally trained fire modeler. And it kind of gives me a unique perspective on how this fire is moving and kind of what I see from a vulnerability point of view and understand how this is impacting the structures. So with that being said, quick overview on some of the Embercast product, which I mentioned. Here is our Embercast results, like about 2 minutes after the watch duty alert popped up in watch duty. We basically ran this model. This model was widely disseminated to the entire brigade program for the LA County Fire, and then it was later circulated throughout the incident because they realized that how accurate it was. We demonstrated well over 80% accuracy in the first 8-hour operational period. And I later learned it was the only technology outside of watch duty that was actively used during the entire incident to keep our brigade firefighters safe and actively engaged in moving to get people out of harm's way. So that was something that was pretty powerful that we came and learned about this. What's unique about this, obviously all models are wrong. Some are useful. As a company, and our expertise is trying to focus on the models that we think get the most value and can lower the bar of entry to get people to use more modeling. So with that being said, who here has heard of a company called Esri? In the lower right, Anthony Schultz, which is the SME for the Wildland Fire Division, is demonstrating the Wildfire Aware app for the X Prize competition here, and you can kind of see how they're potentially using our technology to help better understand how fire moves. The upper right is a demonstration we did with the Woodside Fire Protection District tabletop, where they use our model to eventually lay out the tabletop and then roll it out in a series of time, so they better understand how the fire was impacted, and then tabletop off of that, so they can get that wildfire problem and see the wildfire problem, so they can kind of tabletop around it. Here is Embercast and its making. Here's just a quick video that kind of shows how it works. Instead of having 14 or 15 inputs like our competitors, we only have 2 inputs, and we use the large language models in the background to really pull in the data. Large language models aren't very good at modeling, but they're very good at aggregating data. So it gathers the data for you, and then potentially we can get a result and understand potentially how that fire is moved, and each color represents an hour interval in that fire. And then we have different operational layers in there within major flow paths to minor flow paths, to Embercast lofting locations, to how the fire is moving dynamically and how it's impacting the structures. So that gives you a quick idea of some of the capabilities and how easy they are to use compared to some of the products out there that make it very difficult. So that is a quick overview of Embercast and kind of how it works. I just kind of want to throw that out in good time. I'm going to jump through this. We have a couple of products, the Recon Box solutions, which we build highly curated maps for different industries, and we have 4 different types of maps that are widely used throughout the state. We have these boxes deployed all over California. We have almost 200 out in the wild at this point in time. And then one of our last products that I think is the most exciting product is we have a way to prioritize mitigation locations. So here's a project for City of Beverly Hills where we actually number their mitigation. So we identify where the mitigation locations are going to be, and you have the statistical most effectiveness on where those locations would be. And then we number them based on potentially how many structures those particular locations would burn down if a fire were to start in those locations. That gives us a way to then prioritize them and then better understand how we can do the most good for most amount of people, and then take the focus mitigation money that we have and put it to use and get to help as much people as we can. So I will leave it at that and hand it back over to you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Shay. Very informative. Finally, we have ET from UCLA.
Hi, everyone. Let me just first confirm if you can hear me and see my screen.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So I'm ET. I'm a professor in the civil and environmental engineering at UCLA Samuel E. And my group builds end-to-end physics-based models for assessing and hopefully mitigating wildfire risks. So I'd like to kind of give you my perspectives on how to bridge the gap between what, say, the state has and what the insurance companies might want. So I think both Kelly and Dave said the same things. We have fire hazard severity zone maps by the state, and they tell us where the fires can burn. They're taking into account things like fuels, slope, fire weather, climatology, et cetera. And they also form some regulatory backbone. And they're updated infrequently, and perhaps that's by design. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have insurance risk models like the ones that Kelly was talking about. They tell us expected loss per parcel, although insurance industry is a little bit opaque, perhaps also by design. This is what they do. They are calibrating their models to history, and they're repricing it continuously. So between these two ends, I think what everyone is struggling to capture currently is, of course, the non-stationary climate. And then one of the biggest puzzle pieces, in my view, there is also what the urban fuels are and how the wildfires or fires are spreading from structure to structure. what was a wildland problem is becoming increasingly a wildland-urban interface problem that hasn't been studied with, I think, requisite detail just yet. And at the very end, we need to figure out mitigation credits, like when you do something, what is the effect of that something in terms of dollars or reduced risk? So I think, we need a quantifiable or quantified metric to explore the problem. Just looking at our own corner of the world, looking at California, we know that, for example, the wildfires caused by Santa Ana events have doubled in impact in the last 2 decades. If you just look at the wildfires we've experienced in LA, the reported losses, and I cannot really be sure whether these numbers are correct or not, but this $250 billion. I looked it up. It is equivalent to the gross domestic product of Greece, okay, last year. So these are huge losses. And of course, there's an immediate need to address these things. So how can we bridge these two ends, and I think they've also put a similar workflow. We can start with the climate and fire weather. We can try to estimate what the future weather is going to be, and there are methods that people are working on, like people like Alex, who can tell us with some uncertainty what the future weather is going to be. We can take that information, combine it with our current technologies to map fuels on the ground, whether in the wildland or the urban areas. And then we can use physics-based models to spread those things probabilistically and figure out, what losses we may suffer. And these pieces are being built or have already been in existence for some time, but we can build workflows like this. And we can put these methodologies to stress test. Every methodology that is put to use should be benchmarked against something. And let's take a look at the January 2025 fires we had, and looking at Eaton. With a group of scholars, we've modeled this problem. We've looked at the fuel maps from before the fire that we can extract at 30-meter resolution from satellite images. And we have combined various tools to model the fire spread that started in the wildland areas. I think it was confirmed like 2 days ago that it was started by a SoCal Edison station. And we can model its spread into the urban environments. And we can compare these predictions against the damage that we've observed through post-event reconnaissance efforts. I've participated myself with funds from NSF. We've scoured through the neighborhoods and obtained post-event damage data. These are extremely valuable. A, they can tell us whether some mitigation measure worked or not, and B, we can use those data to benchmark our predictive models. And then if we have validated models, then we can test the quantifiably utility of the interventions in silico. We can do computer simulations and test, how much improvement we've made. We can, for example, look at fuel treatments and fire breaks. We can re-edit the fuel map in this computer simulation and see what impacts it has on a neighborhood. We can also look at the urban texture and see whether home hardening, these zone zero enhancements, will change in ignition and spread parameters in our simulations. We can also see if some corridor improvements for power lines, et cetera, will make an impact, in a quantifiable way. We can figure out these risk interventions and convert these into dollar amounts, parcel by parcel, community by community, corridor by corridor, essentially. And the playbook for this is what inspires me, is what I've learned from years of work in earthquake engineering with many colleagues. We have similar workflows in earthquake engineering. They're veritable, they're benchmarked, and they're used in practice today. They take the hazard characterization all the way down to loss analysis. And I think we can translate that in workflow and re-instrument it for wildfires and create some workflow that takes us from hazard characterization to quantified community losses. And then in this loop, we can evaluate the value of mitigations. So what I hope we can discuss today, among other things, is, first of all, I totally agree with what was said before. The risk product should be probabilistic because there's many uncertainties or modeling uncertainties, aleatory uncertainties due to future weather unknown, all of that. And I think among one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle there is the urban fuels. they're, I think, the shared blind spot of hazard zonation actuarial maps, and they essentially decided what happened in Eaton, Altadena. Mitigation credits should be, figured out through these simulations. And I think all of the pieces are there for creating some operational decision grade wildfire risk platform, at least for California and possibly beyond. So those are my slides. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ET. I'm just going to quickly tee off the conversation. ET and Shay did a nice job telling us a little bit about their approaches to modeling the hazard, especially. And Dave, I appreciated so much your distinction between hazard and risks. So I'm wondering if we can focus on the hazard for a second. And Dave and Kelly, would you be able to tell us, just in general terms, how you all go about modeling the hazard so we can surface some of these differences between the modeling approaches? Because that might not have quite come out.
Sure,
Kelly, do you want to? Yeah, Dave, either one.
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
Basically, because we take what is largely a body of sort of formed in fire science under sort of nominal sort of forest and wildland kinds of approaches to fire behavior assessment. In fire hazard severity zones, which is a state regulatory map that is solely hazard, it does not confer risk. We again decouple hazard into two components, likelihood and intensity. And the likelihood comes from a fairly simplistic, currently, mathematical model allocating past fire amounts into strata that form basically modern era fire regimes. And so we develop a likelihood that a particular area is going to burn by making the landscape pooled into these unique kinds of strata. Those strata are formed basically based on kind of climate region and fuel type. And we get an estimate of likelihood. It's a singular estimate, not a multifaceted estimate decomposing different kinds of fire intensities. It's basically like a worst case scenario. So that's the burn probability part. The fire behavior part is largely done via existing standard models that are basically encapsulated in a lot of the two-dimensional fire spread models that you've seen, including like Flam Mapper, where fuels, terrain features, and fuel moisture, along with wind speed, gives you an estimate of the fire's behavior, its rate of spread, its energy release rate. The one kind of unique component that is necessary to understanding fire exposure in urbanized communities is they don't behave like wildland fuels. And you have to do some things with our existing models. There are emergent models that are getting much better physics for inclusion of structural fuels in spread. But firebrands, the casting of burning material ahead of the fire's front, has been noted as a very important kind of ignition mechanism in urban conflagrations. And so our hazard model looks at wildlands, their likelihood and their intensity, and then generates a modeled amount of firebrands that come from a source cell. The winds then deposit those downwind according to basically a density function kernel that we assign. And we accumulate those firebrands where they land, and we use that as a foundational hazard metric in the urban environment. All of these themes are in pretty rapid advanced development within research and management right now. So things are changing very, very rapidly. My expectation is with the 2030 release of FHSC, we will likely have an operational spread model in urban landscapes. And just to really focus on the challenge there is individual fuel elements of structures, their ignition and then subsequently their capacity to contribute to fire spread is a probabilistic function. And it's likely being influenced by really fine scale variability that we don't have the ability to really measure or capture. And so there's some very, very interesting modeling approaches that are in sort of mid-levels of development that I'm anticipating hopefully become operational in time for us to release that next version. So that's kind of in a nutshell how we're characterizing hazard in FHSC. And it's got some weaknesses for sure. It is a long-term kind of we don't look at current fuels in FHSC. We look at fuels over the course of basically the lifespan of a house mortgage, roughly. And so it's really a hazard potential across a fairly long time frame.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. Kelly, tell us about their approach and
Jump in here with some brief color commentary. So
yeah.
really, insurers use sort of some complementary approaches. We traditionally, for very big hazards like wildfire, flood, hurricane, earthquake, we use tools called catastrophe models, which simulate hypothetical scenarios over very large amounts of time, not like projecting forward into the future, but many simulations. So typically, operational models might vary from 10,000 year simulations to 100,000 year simulations. And the goal here is to simulate events that have not occurred in the historical record, but that are physically plausible based on pre-existing conditions, using many of the same sorts of techniques that Dave, you were just mentioning, right? That we have, fuels layers and some defense assumptions and slope and terrain and wind speed, and right, we're using very, very similar sorts of event generation, but they're not meant to reproduce an event as it's happening in real time. They're meant to say, given the environmental conditions that are available in a particular location, what types of events are plausible? What sizes of events? Where do we expect a catastrophic event could plausibly occur? Now, California, of course, famously has not allowed the use of catastrophe models for a long time. That's changing now, but it means that insurers also supplement with hazard layers, so that we're trying to identify where are there areas that are at relatively high risk. Again, using many of the same types of tools with fuel layers and land use and so forth, and we calibrate those using information with like wind speed and direction, and then our claims history, right? So to try and understand beyond just where your fuels layers are, that's part of how we sort of expand out into urban areas that otherwise on many fuels maps show as not being particularly burnable. So I think those two techniques are really complementary, because the benefit of event generation is it lets you see what are events that are plausibly large or that occur outside of areas that you would otherwise see, and you can use that to look deep into the tail of rare events, right? Deep into the probability distribution of rare events. But hazard layers can be really powerful tools, because for a small footprint event like a wildfire, even a very big wildfire is small in footprint relative to something like a hurricane, it can be difficult to get what we describe as convergence for very rare events. As in, you just don't have enough events to generate spatial coverage at enough density to be able to say something real about like your very high risk areas. So we supplement and complement those with these hazard accumulation tools, where we say, okay, well, here's my overall hazard layer, and then I want to slice and dice it down based on this is where we expect the highest wind events. This is where we expect our Santa Anas or other katabatic style winds, so that we can look for places where we have large risk accumulations that are not necessarily tied to a specific fire footprint. So I see those tools as being complementary to each other. Of course, we have to do all of this in an environment where we're doing sensitivity testing for climate change, as I showed in my slides a second ago. But I think understanding what component of that is hazard specific and how those tools kind of help to fill the gaps between each other is a helpful framework that's a little different in perspective than like an operational type of model. Like Shay, you were describing modeling events kind of in real time. Insurers don't typically do a lot of that because our time frame is slightly different. Ours is more on writing on the time scale of like a 1-year policy or 5 to 10 years of sort of portfolio.
Or your cat model, yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. So we've surfaced, I think, some differences in approaches, and of course differences in motivations that also lead us to differences in approaches. I'm going to pull out one of these questions from our audience here. For any and all panelists, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges in working across sectors? Consistency in data models, representation of uncertainty and key values, communication language, et cetera. I think, also adding on to that, are there efforts that you're aware of that are underway or should be underway to help us intercompare these models or try to pull the valuable components of some existing models for a certain application into other applications? What kind of crosstalk is there or should there be to encourage progress in developing a shared understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of these approaches and how they could be mutually improved?
Dave,
Like,
you want to take that one? I think that'd be good for Dave to take with the modeling competition.
Well, I will start that the fire behavior community is widely recognized that urban conflagrations are a big science gap. There are a number of ongoing institutions, and it's worth noting that the urban conflagration issue has now brought together two really previously largely disparate components of scientific discipline. That's forestry and wildland fire behavior and fire protection engineering. Fire protection engineering is basically structure fire, and it has a long history of very successful engineering solutions to fire containment. Up until recently, like we've generally eliminated large multi-story structures from large fire events. Um, it is a real commingling of very porous vegetation, wildland fire spread with structure, discontinuous, large, clumpy kinds of fuels, and it presents some really interesting physics challenges for putting a model together that can conduct analysis that captures both of those kinds of landscapes. Um, there's some really interesting stuff going on out there, but I think the most interesting to the group is that there is a community of practice that is starting to generate itself through collaborations of multiple kinds of agency, private sector, and academic institutions really trying to address this problem in a cohesive kind of fashion. I recently participated in, and Shay was an entrant in this. I was on the planning committee for a fire science challenge on wildfire risk modeling, and we had 43 model submissions that looked at different approaches and different sort of focuses. But we got in a room and we started to generate ideas and potential for collaboration, for aggregation of models, for ensemble development, where models are run differently on the same kinds of events, and you start to look at how they differ and make some insights into how the models are deducing their findings. So I guess I'm pretty optimistic that this is unfortunate. It basically is a function of having a bunch of really terrible, catastrophic kinds of events. And they're not just happening in the Western United States now, they're happening all over Southern Europe, in Southwestern South America, Australia, Greece, South Africa, etc. The problem has really suddenly exploded at a global scale, and that's drawing a lot of attention and bringing people together to build this community of practice. Traditionally, this has been a really relatively niche kind of sector, and I think we can benefit from the expansion of a lot more interested parties.
Yeah, I saw a paper just a couple weeks ago that analyzed wildfire research over the course of the last 25 years, and across the 3,600 or so studies that they looked at, they found that wildland and urban interface and urban areas account for over 33% of global fire occurrence, but receive only 4% of research attention, right? Dave, as you were saying, like most of this lived in forestry world before. We especially found that in our research with Swiss Re, is that there's a ton of really promising research on fuels treatments that originated in the forestry sphere, but like how to take it to that last mile problem of a fuel treatment will produce a benefit of whatever amount to a community is where now that research is happening that's really fruitful, but is definitely still in the emerging phases. So like as we're trying to make decisions about how we build our environment now, we need to think carefully about the fact that research is very much still emerging.
That's useful perspective. Anyone else? E.T., Shay?
Yeah, and I'm gonna jump in on some of the stuff is, some of the stuff is rocket scientists. If you look at some of the stuff that Dave works on and some of the Rothmel equations and how this, it's some of the most brilliant math I've ever seen and some of the most complicated math I've ever seen. And there's actually very few organizations and people out there that actually been able to crack and properly use the math in the correct way. And And it's because there, like as Kelly alluded to, there hasn't been a lot of money and research money into doing this. And even at this competition, we have all these companies coming together, but there isn't any general pool of or any kind of motivation to get them to work together. Like some of them are starting to work together, but I still think there needs to be a different approach where it's like, hey, we need to incentivize these companies to partner and find ways to work together. Because I think a lot of the companies that had very different approaches to different things, and we combine some of those, we have some really incredible products. But like, how do we get the companies to start having those conversations? And so there is definitely a barrier to entry that I noticed at this last event that I went to.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
If I can, I'll just
yeah.
jump in with ET's comment about benchmarking. There are a lot of models out there that need to get intercomparisons. There's a recent work on, it's basically a project out of the Wildfire Interdisciplinary Research Center at San Jose State under Dr. Craig Clement. He's got a number of fire behavior professors working under him. One of the projects is called Firebench, and they are asking people to contribute their code, and we can actually do these systematic kind of benchmarkings for model performance. I hate to say this because I've seen it happen, and I've been the recipient of outcomes of this that are kind of spurious because of it. Folks have an outcome that they want, and they'll go out and they'll shop around for a model that'll give them that output. What we want are models tested and calibrated against real life occurrences. That's really how you get fundamental inference, that you've got the model tuned, that it is responsive to the inputs that are driving the event and causing the impact. So, that sounds a little, pie in the sky, but ultimately that really is the gold standard for moving science along. And I do think that the science community in this space is highly socialized now to conducting those kinds of intercomparisons.
And then I'll just jump in quickly. From the climate community made tremendous progress when we all decided to intercompare our models and have systematic frameworks for model intercomparison.
We love a myth.
That they
Model
love a
intercomparison
myth.
project.
Model
There's every
intercomparison
kind of myth
project.
that you can think of.
And so I just think that is really a necessary next step, and that takes some community organization. Just wanted to wrap up with one final topic here. A lot of chatter in the Q&A about vegetation and zone zero. I wanted to, ET, you laid out a nice framework for doing counterfactual or kind of what if scenarios here where we can actually use models to ask questions around risk mitigation and the effectiveness of risk reduction. Maybe you could just, how do you think those tools might be used to address these kind of questions that we have, which are especially pressing here in Southern California around fuels treatments in chaparral and shrublands, and also vegetation management around structures?
Yeah, I think it all goes through still, the use of validated benchmark tools. If we as a community converge on these tools and say, okay, these are veritable tools with which we can simulate the future, then we can always, go ahead and create some scenario fuel treatment or, mitigating hazard by treating the urban environment and see what impacts it has on the risks. I think, there's a little bit of missing science in how the fire is spreading in the urban environment, because not a lot of people have studied it just yet. And we haven't really had, field evidence to fully benchmark our urban fire spread codes. But it's converging and more people are being interested in it. And there's some convergence within different communities. So once those are put in place, we can always examine, potential outcomes when you do this treatment or that. We all know that, the risk that you have as a homeowner, for example, is not just related to what you do in your own property or parcel. I think there's a community issue. You may have a very resilient home based on your parcel evaluation, but if your neighbors are not, you're still going to suffer the consequences. So there are multiple scales at which this has to be evaluated. And of course, insurance companies know that too. they're not going to give you cheap insurance just because your house looks safe if it's in a very dangerous area or community. But you can use these physics-based simulations as an oracle. And the more we validate them, the more useful they'll be with less uncertainty.
Yeah, and I kind of just jump on that. Like, we've done a tremendous amount of RDT in that space and evaluating that. And we've done a lot of the research that RET is kind of digging into now, probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And unfortunately, one of our biggest findings was our physics-based models suggested that what it's actually in the structure actually matters more, or than the structures are actually built of. So it's how do you go about capturing what's in everybody's home, right? And everybody say, but like all the plastics and everything else, and that if that's what that couch that's just like, every firefighter has been on fire and has a couch that doesn't go out because it keeps relighting. It's one of those things is like, if the stuff on the inside is actually more indicative of how that fire propagates through community, like how do we even start to even capture that? So it gets really, there's no low-hanging fruit. A lot of low-hanging fruit for some of these companies have kind of already been addressed, but when you really dive deep into the math, which is kind of what we do at Flame Upper, it's complex. And there is no easy answer. There's some answers, but is it the right answers? And like I said, that's where I think Dave points out, we need some sort of benchmark testing to figure out how do we know if these are the right answers? How do we compare? I cannot agree more with that comment, because I've seen a lot of people out there selling things, but like, that's not the right way to do it. Why are they doing it that way? And their comments is, well, no one else is doing anything else, but we don't want to be pushing the wrong science. We need to build trust in the community, and we need to do that together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it means sort of thinking carefully about how to apply the right mitigation to the right context. Because on the one hand, we do have things that are clearly being shown to work in a variety of different environments. I mean, a post-disaster survey from IBHS, which is a research organization that's focused on doing sort of building level mitigation, found that if you have more than 25% vegetative coverage within zone 0, right, in 0 to 5, they found between an 87 to 100% chance that the structure would be destroyed if it was in the fire footprint. Versus it's certainly a high odds even without that. It might be a 30 to 50% depending on what other characteristics were in place. But like that is if you have a building that is completely surrounded by vegetation, like the odds of getting through a fire are very low. But I think we need to think very carefully about how to trade off on those risks, because one of the other, and again, very consistently comes through in the literature, is a very strong predictor of wildfire risk is structure separation distance. That if you're within 10 feet of your neighbor, you can do everything right, but if your neighbor's house burns, they're going to burn your house down from the inside. So should we be telling people to put in 5 feet of vegetation clearance when they're 6 feet from their neighbor? I don't think we know the answer to that. And where that is a common situation, we should be thinking very hard about prioritizing those communities for the community level hardening, sort of hardening the boundaries of a community to protect against flames getting into the community to begin with, and doing those fuels treatments. Because saying that, oh, well, you are going to protect your own house and that's the only thing you have to worry about, clearly is not working.
Yeah, I like that context dependence. I think that's probably really critical. ET, you had your hand up there, or I don't know if that's from a previous.
Yeah. I wanted to say a few words. And these comments are also inspired by earthquake engineering, but there are certain things that the insurance industry will do. For example, if it's not a profitable market, insurance industry can retreat from this market and do other business, and they should be fine. And then, of course, there's no benefit to the people, to the communities. Of course, then the government has to do certain things, some regulations, and force people to do certain things that they're not necessarily ready to do. And so if you're building new properties adjacent to the wildland urban interface, you'll have to figure out what to impose on them, and how separation distance, this, that, the other thing, so that those new construction at least are less vulnerable than what we already have. And then comes the question of what is the performance criteria? Like, what is the thing that you're trying to achieve? For example, I'll just give a basic and maybe naive example, but if you have a home in the high Sierras and it's very, prone to wildfires, maybe we should not impose anything on you or as a performance criteria to protect that home. Maybe the best criteria is life safety. Just achieve life safety, have these people exit the property, and that's all we spend the money on. But in a place like maybe Eaton or some other WUI adjacent community, WUI community, then the criteria is different. But we're also missing these performance objectives, like what is it that we're trying to achieve? And I think only perhaps the government can decide on that. And we do have those performance objectives really well defined, say for earthquakes or hurricanes, not yet for wildfires.
Yeah, and I think that raises an important point, which is that we have all this uncertainty and we've identified pieces of the problem that are very poorly understood and very poorly modeled. And yet we have real world actors that have to make decisions now. So, insurance companies have to decide, how they want to, or if they want to issue policies, and if so, at what price. The state has to decide what regulations to issue. So there's a real decision making under uncertainty dynamic here that I think is a reality. So that I think underscores the urgency of the science also in terms of filling these gaps. Any final comments from our panelists here? We have a couple minutes left.
I'm trying to, I see people requesting links, and so I'm trying to stick a few of those in the chat. I'll see if I can keep uploading here quickly, but I saw someone asked about, like, if we're doing new development, are there things that we should be thinking about, which is a question I really appreciate, because of course, however we build now is what we will be living with for the next, 50, 60, 70 years. And so in an environment where we know hazard is increasing, what should we be thinking about? And I will say that an area that, well, for one thing, like I said, this 10 feet of separation seems to be a really sort of a critical distance that's been flagged in, for example, the IBHS community prepared wildfire standard, that having separation between structures is really critical. Of course, California mostly doesn't build that way. And as we've expanded accessory dwelling units, it makes it even more challenging. So we're trying to address housing affordability by building more housing at a density that makes it challenging to protect against wildfire. So thinking comprehensively about sort of the relative trade-offs between different types of housing developments, I think it's something that we should be flagging as, like, if you're a developer, it may actually be challenging for to minimize risk for your community if your houses are all 5 feet apart. So thinking about that at the planning stages is a really powerful tool. And we have seen developers who have started to roll out essentially wildfire prepared communities to take this as a test case. And so we're really excited to see that rolled into new markets. But of course, California doesn't build a lot of housing. There's quite a large housing stock that's already there. So we have to balance, how do we decide on what to do with new builds versus what can we most effectively do and most cost effectively do for retrofits. So it's a little bit of both and, but I really appreciate that forward-looking question, because how we build our building stock now will matter for decades to come.
I think that's a great place for us to wrap up here. This has been super interesting and informative for me. I hope we gave our audience a sense of the state of flux in this space and where we need to be making more investments and understanding, and the difficulties in making decisions now under this state of uncertainty. We will be following up with a link to the recording for this webinar, so you'll be able to review the material that we've covered today. And also stay tuned for our third webinar, which will be coming up in the next few months. We are aiming for something similarly stimulating and informative. So thank you so much for staying tuned, and we look forward to the next time. Thank you.